Good afternoon. Today is October 18, 2016. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. My name is Belong Yang. I'm the chair of this committee, and with me today are Council President Johnson, Councilmember Gordon, Palmisano, and Reich, and Councilmember Quincy will not be joining us today as he has some business to attend to. We are a quorum of this committee, and so we can conduct the committee's business. Today we have 8 items on our agenda. 2 of them are discussion items, and the first 6 are consent items, and I will read the items, and then we will take care of the consent portion before we go to the discussion items. The first item is a travel expense donation acceptance from the Police Executive Research Forum. Second item is a travel expense donation acceptance from the Jewish Community Relations Council. The third item is a travel expense donation acceptance from the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The fourth item is a memorandum of understanding with the Arts Institute International, Minnesota. The fifth item is a grant acceptance from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, Homeland Security, and Emergency Management Division for the Urban Area Security Initiative grant. And the sixth item is a contract with Foresight Consulting to provide comprehensive emergency operations center exercise services. Then the last 2 items are discussion items. One of the items is a memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And the second item is a public accommodations anti-discrimination resolution. And with that, council members, any questions on items 1 through 6, the consent items? Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On item 5, is there a accompanying document that tells how this $977,000 is going to get spent, or where would that information be?
Council President Johnson, I can get that for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I will move all 6 items from the consent agenda for approval. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. Item number 7, which is a discussion item, is a memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And with us today is Deputy Chief Bruce Falkins. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you, Council Chair Yang. This memorandum of understanding is to have a framework of a partnership between the Minneapolis Police Department and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms. If I can say just ATF from now on, helps me from stumbling over my words. What this is a process where when we recover discharged cartridge casings at a crime scene or discharged weapon scene, or even from a test-fired firearm that we have taken into custody, that we typically will then enter that into the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, NIBIN machine. That then will correlate it if it's correlated to any other shell casings that have been entered into the system from other cases around the country, actually. And when that typically happens, Tim Sitlow, who works in our firearms section, will make computer comparisons of potential matches, and he takes the ones that look like a match, and then he forwards that on to our firearms examiners. And then when a firearms examiner gets it, they look at the individual shell casings under a microscope. They actually retrieve the evidence and put it under a microscope to verify if or not if they're a match to each other. What this memorandum of understanding does is it allows us to use the National Correlation Center that the ATF has established down. It's down southern United States. I forgot the city it's in, I'm sorry. But what it does is they have their own version of our Tim Sitlow down there that are doing the computer comparisons. What they can do for us in this process is if there's a computer match to these shell casings, they can send that information back to us as a lead and not probable cause, because due to our crime lab's accreditation policies and procedures, they have to be verified by a firearms examiner, which takes time, and before it can be disseminated to the investigator. This allows us to get that lead, not probable cause, but a lead back to the investigators within 24 to 48 hours of submission to the correlation center. So it's a way to get that information into the hands of the investigator sooner so that they can respond to that lead and try to follow up on their case. Is there any questions that I can answer to this?
Oh, Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Chief. That's helpful. I know we're meeting next week just to talk about this very thing, but I do remember when I toured the crime lab, and it was probably, I suppose it was Forensics Week or something, but it was probably a year ago. It was because it was before the mayor's last budget,
Okay.
and she was putting another forensic scientist in her budget. So what was said to me at that time was that we were behind in processing the shell casings, that we had a backlog. Is that still the case, or where are we at?
No, ma'am, we are, I checked last Wednesday
Uh-huh.
after receiving an email from you, Council President, and we were current as of the day before
Okay.
entering our shell casings. The only time that we would fall anywhere behind, so to say, is if, like Tim Sitlow, he had surgery
Sure.
recently.
Mm.
He was gone for a week, but then we had
Mhm.
made arrangements to have somebody else actually
I
doing
see.
those entries. So we are keeping up to date
Great.
on those entries
Great. Okay, great. Thank
into
you.
the system.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, I will move item number 7 for approval. Any discussion on that? All right. Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. The motion carries. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Item number 8 is a public accommodations anti-discrimination resolution. And to start us out, I'm going to welcome Councilmember Warsami, who used to be a member of this committee, and somehow he left us. And so he's back, at least for today. And he's going to give us an introduction of this resolution, and then from there we will have staff present. And so please, Councilmember Warsami, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's good to be back in the committee as a guest today. And first of all, let me start with the reason why we took this up is because of the national discourse that we're having currently, where you have, blatant discrimination against members of the LGBT community, members of the Muslim community, and immigrants. And where you have cities and other jurisdictions that have had discrimination with regards to public accommodation. And as you know, Mr. Chair, it was 1964 that Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act banning discrimination in public accommodations. And, federal law has since expanded this protected classes to include religion and disability. However, cities such as Minneapolis also provides protections for creed, ancestry, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, or status with regard to public assistance. So the reason why we brought this up is to highlight that we have these laws, and we find it, problematic that in today's society, that even in the city of Minneapolis, there are discriminations against people with regards to their sexual orientation, or their religion, or the fact that they're immigrants, or the fact that they're people of color. And this provision, as will be explained by city staff, aims to educate first, not just to, not to punish, not to point fingers at those businesses that we feel and sometimes we have evidence that are discriminating, but to educate and to persuade them to follow the provisions of the Civil Rights Ordinance of our city, and then to gather evidence, and then to take the steps that we need to take in order to get corrective measures. So I think this is a very timely resolution, and what it does is it guides the city staff and the city enterprise as a whole to move forward on this important civil rights provision. So I would like to give opportunity to city staff. And I'd like to thank civil rights staff, especially Director Velma Corbell, who's worked on this and has guided me throughout to bring this resolution to the committee. So I'll take it back to you, Chair.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chair Yang and committee members. My name is Danielle Shelton-Volchak, and I'm the Director of the Complaint Investigations Division for the Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights. And I'm just going to add a little bit more context to what Councilman Warsame just spoke about. Today, we're in front of you to urge your passage in support of the Public Accommodations Anti-Discrimination Resolution that you see before you today. The City of Minneapolis has a long history of furthering anti-discrimination in public accommodations. In fact, the City of Minneapolis has greater protected classes in public accommodation than the state does, and even the federal government. But when the Public Accommodations Ordinance was enacted in the late 60s, discrimination looked very different. Gone are the days when a business person might say, "I'm not serving you because you're Black." Or gone are the days when a business person might say to a woman, "I'm going to defer to your husband and wait for me to talk to him." Now we're in the 21st century, and while the industries of public accommodation discrimination may not have changed, the ways in which discrimination presents itself has. In the city's most recent resident survey, which was in 2012, 13% of respondents indicated that they had been discriminated against while getting service in a restaurant or a store. Additionally, the department has heard through various communication channels, such as word of mouth, traditional, and social media, what was reflected in the resident survey, but also discrimination in the transportation industry. And like I said, discrimination looks a little bit different in the 21st century. Now it's less conspicuous at times, and it can exhibit itself in multiple ways, including slow or non-existent service, following an individual in a store, relegation to less desirable tables at restaurants, differing applications in dress codes, failure to pick up people of color or drop off people in the transportation context in certain neighborhoods, or allowing intolerance or harassment in a public accommodation sphere based on ethnic, religious, or gender identity. The fact that these prohibitive practices are happening shows a lack of awareness on the side of business. And conversely, victims of discrimination may be unaware that they've even been discriminated against. This resolution provides an opportunity to discuss these issues in front of this committee and to start a greater conversation. But because we don't have any single charging parties or complainants in these various discrimination mechanisms, the resolution allows us to first, as the department, go out and educate businesses, as Councilman Warsame indicated earlier, and educate them about their rights and obligations as to consumers. It also allows us to educate consumers about prohibitive behavior and their recourse. Third, it allows us to give notice to everyone that the department and the city will have an emphasis on public accommodation research and investigation. And then finally, it will allow us to be conciliatory in advance of any stricter enforcement. Because public accommodations are establishments that provide goods and services to the general public, which include but aren't limited to restaurants, theaters, hotels, hospitals, gas stations, private transportation, and retail stores, equal access for all people is paramount to meet basic necessities, as well as increasing residents' overall satisfaction with living in our community. Therefore, I urge this committee to support the Public Accommodations Anti-Discrimination Resolution before you today. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Any questions? Councilmember Gordon?
So I did want to hear a little bit more about the targeted testing that's going to be done. I think in the resolution, one of the resolve clause has people are going to go out and I just want to understand, are we hiring people? Are volunteers going to do this? The staff people doing this? Is this going to be focused on particular businesses? I'm assuming this doesn't involve employment or housing.
Correct.
But it's services. So maybe you can just explain a little bit more of the breadth of that, and even the funding. I don't quite understand that. I think doing this kind of thing is something I see that has great value and might even in other areas. So I'm curious to hear more about it.
Sure. We don't have anything specific at this point regarding who will be the testing. We have reached out who will do the testing. We have reached out to business licensing. They have done this type of thing before. So we reached out to them to say, okay, what type of procedures did you put in place? What worked, what didn't? Whom did you use? Why did you use those particular people? What were the costs associated with it? What was the time associated with it? What were the results? Did you, from their perspective, did they feel as if they that the results were valid? Were there any issues that may have brought into question the testing that they did? So right now we're exploring that, because when we do go into testing, we want to make sure that it's done correctly, that we're using the right people, whether it's staff or hiring someone, and then assessing the costs associated with that. So at this point, we don't have that information on who specifically we're going to be using. The other thing is that we are working with our Civil Rights Commission, and they are doing further investigation and research, a group of them, to look into testing in other jurisdictions based on the industries we would be looking at, probably more broad, restaurants, retail, possibly public transportation, or private transportation, and they'll gather their data, and then we'll sit down and determine what's the best recourse, and are we in line with maybe best practices around other regions in doing our testing. I don't think that you can go into testing very lightly, because you want it to be substantial. We want to make sure that it's also cost effective. And so when we're doing it, not only are we looking at just the bottom line, but making sure that it can stand on its own as something that that the community can look at and verify that, yes, in fact, this was a good testing procedure, and that we can rely on it as a department and as a city. So that's my answer.
So this reminds me quite a bit of compliance checks for underage selling of cigarettes or even drinking. I mean, that I know, so I know that business licensing and other partners like the police do these kinds of tests. Mm-hmm. But in those cases, then they actually lead to citations and prosecutions. And is that the kind of testing that'll be done here, or do we think it's going to go there? We're not sure yet.
Well, I do want to indicate that first, before we do this enforcement and this testing, we do want to reach out to businesses first and educate that we're not about catching people in the act. We're making sure that everybody understands how this manifests and how this looks in our 21st century discrimination and what rights and responsibilities are. When we get to the testing portion of it, we will be looking at enforcing the ordinance. That's what we're here to do. We are an enforcement department. But before doing that, we do want to educate people. How that enforcement looks at this point, we haven't worked out yet. But ultimately, people will be held responsible for discriminatory behavior. That's what we do within the Civil Rights Department. That's why our ordinance and anti-discrimination ordinance is in place. But we want to give them an opportunity ahead of time to be educated about it, and to be able to look and assess within their organization or within their business that whether these problems are happening, and give them an opportunity to address them before we get to those points.
I appreciate that. I like that approach as well. I think, and I understand that this is about education. This is about setting the intention. This is just about letting people know who's protected and who isn't, and what we consider discrimination. I just was drilling into that testing idea because it's intriguing to me for other reasons. And I agree that if somebody comes in and there's a problem, it's great to give them a chance to demonstrate how they can fix the problem. That's really what we want. We want people complying and not discriminating. We don't necessarily want to add more burdens onto people unnecessarily. So I appreciate that. I think I'm going to kind of think of this as a pilot. I think you're developing a kind of a new approach in terms of the testing idea and the testers, and I'll be curious to hear about how it goes and what happens, and maybe even how it is going as it's being developed, because it might have potential then in other areas where we see there's problems, for example, in housing and employment. And I also see it in the community. There might be ways to do it that is even low cost. So this also reminds me of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, where they just did a little bit of an audit of filing a police complaint, and I think they had volunteers do that. Might have been some city staff in the department, I'm not sure. But that just, it was only 13 or 16. It was a small sampling, but it revealed some information, even something as cheap as calling for a cab from different parts of the city and seeing what kind of responses and reactions come could give us some good information about services and if there seems to be discrimination. So I think it's an interesting area to get into. Commend you and Councilmember Warsame for bringing it forward. Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I just have one small, tiny question, I hope. With regards to this resolution, we're not making any law per se, right?
Chair Yang, that is correct. We're not making any new law here. No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, seeing no other questions, I will move that we adopt the passage of the resolution. Any discussion on that? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. And with that, we are done with our business before this committee, so we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you so much.